Hello, everybody. Welcome back to class. Got about 5 minutes till it's 5:30, but it's good to be here with you guys. If you're watching it now or in the future or anytime, hope you're having a good day. And we're about to launch into our meeting on philosophy of religion. We got another argument for God's existence to analyze and to break down. But anyways, appreciate you guys' hard work and attendance. And we will all get started in a couple minutes. Welcome, everybody. Anybody showing up, feel free to say hi or just tap into the chat. Be right back. Good evening. Hi. Hello, everybody. Daly, Ricardo. Hope you guys are doing well. Yeah, it's been really hot, so I don't know. I have my AC going like all the time lately. Push my power bill probably double last cycle, but you know it'll get cooler pretty soon, I assume. Therefore, not a big deal. It's been a good day so far. My Tuesdays are easier than my Mondays and Wednesdays. Tuesdays and Thursdays are easier than Monday and Wednesday from my schedule this term. Yes, hello. Still a couple minutes till class time gets going, but nice to see we've got a good crew already. And yeah, just have some more notes on this stuff about philosophy of religion for you guys, and then we'll be on to our evening. Okay, a couple minutes. Hello, hello, hello. Hope your guys' other classes are going well. A lot of Zoom meetings, I assume. Hi, Brittany. Alexandra, good to see you too. Hey, Sierra. Anybody use a smartwatch? I keep like a Garmin watch because I'm always running, you know? And so I check in on my heart rate at times, you know, just to see how I'm doing. Pretty relaxed right now. 60, but it could be lower. Okay. Good evening. It's been a good day so far. Just giving this lecture, and then have a good evening. I'm gonna probably watch some of the Laker game. Yeah. Take you guys out to the evening and We'll be all good. Well, when did you send me your email? I did reply to a message from a student asking a question about it. My answer was that it's not been assigned yet. It's assigned the due date of the 1st September the 29th. Yeah, let me check something real quick just to make sure I'm getting your question. I'm just opening my inbox one time real fast. So let me see here. Is this okay? Hey everybody, I know it's 5:30 now, so welcome to class and we're gonna get started. But the question here, medium J, is that Danica? Did you send, is that Danica's name on YouTube? Medium J, please let me know. You're Joel? Okay, I'm double checking something really fast. Joel what? I'm trying to look for in my inbox. I don't see any messages from you at all. Maybe I'm getting it wrong here and look for this one. I don't know, Joel. There's no homework so far anyway, but to answer your question. But yeah, I don't think you sent me the message. When did you send it? To who? To me? Did you spell my name right? What happened? I don't have no message from you. The readings are according to the syllabus. On the 29th, the first essay is due. My policy is to give you guys about 2 weeks to work on it, so I send you to the prompts about 2 weeks before. That would be the 15th next week. But since I see some people are really eager to get started, I'm going to just send you the distribution of the prompts this week, okay? So I'm going to give it to you next class, and then you can get started working on it anytime after that. So you're going to have more than 2 weeks. You're going to have like almost 20 days to do it. So not to worry, not to worry. But I was trying to look for your message, and I don't see nothing in there. Let me show you how to spell it. I check all my messages every day, so there's no way I didn't get it. And they've all been returned. I've replied to everybody. So this is my email address that you see here, rvulich@fullerton.edu. So I don't know. Maybe you sent it as a comment or something, but I would have seen that too if it had been sent in one of our other delivery systems that we have in Titanium. But look, anyways, yeah. Back to what I was saying. The prompts are coming to you next class, and the first papers are due on the 29th. There's 2 papers in the class and 2 exams. So no, there's not like sent through Outlook. Okay, hold on. I don't see nothing from nobody named Joel. Do you have a different email, like name or something? When did you send it? Well, whatever, man. You're gonna have to clarify when you sent it. Maybe give me your full name, but there's nothing there in my inbox. I want to make sure though that you can send me messages in the correct way. If you sent me something last week, definitely I would have already given you a reply. School mail, yeah. I don't know. Send me another email right now. Can you do that for me? Send me another email right now, okay, Joel? Let's see if your email is working to me. Send it to me, and if you do, I have another window open, and it's going to show a notification, okay? So please send me an email. Let's see if you can send it to me before the class is over. All right, so back to what I was saying. I don't want anybody in this class to think that I'm not answering emails. I'm answering 100% of every email every day, so I want to make sure that this gets straightened out for you, Joel. But either way, just know that nothing has been ignored. Your first paper is due on the 29th, and we're giving you the prompts very soon. but I don't have any history of missing student emails, so I have to believe that maybe something was problematic with the delivery itself. Send me another message. You say you sent me something? Still don't have nothing. I don't have nothing from you. Write out in this chat bar the full email address that you're sending this to. Because there's nothing from you. My last message is from a totally different class, different class. All right, Joel, maybe you've got some delivery issues on your end. I'm not sure what the situation is there. But thanks for bringing it to my attention, and we'll just have to see what happens with your messages. Okay, so yeah, let me just try and review what we were doing last time, guys. We're talking about the philosophy of religion, and we've already gone over one big argument, which was the ontological argument. Here, wait, sorry, Joel. It's still not there yet. Nah, okay. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with that. So back to what I was saying. Okay, so we were looking at the cosmological argument and the ontological argument. These are the first two big arguments presented for the existence of God that we studied in our class. So the ontological argument, by now we kind of know it. We've learned it, and we've talked about some objections to it. It was first stated by St. Anselm like 1,000 years ago, and I just want to say really quickly what the basic idea of it is. That argument says that the definition of God is the greatest conceivable being. And that definition is one that he thinks everyone has in their mind, whether they're a theist or an atheist. So the next point he makes is that some things only exist in the mind and some things exist in the mind and in reality. But since God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, he must exist in both because it is greater to exist in both. And therefore, if he didn't exist in both, then the greatest conceivable being would not be the greatest conceivable being. So he has to exist in both. Therefore, he's real. He can't even be thought not to exist because that would also be less great than if he could not be thought not to exist. So God cannot be thought not to exist. And if atheists say they think there's no God, they must be thinking of something else because that thought's not possible. Okay, and then we talked about all the objections. Gaunilo said, I can make up an idea of a lost island, but we know it's not real. G.E. Moore said existence is not a predicate. He used the example of comparing tigers growl with tigers exist. And then William Rose said that you could define something as existing, but if it doesn't, then that didn't prove anything. Like I could say magic hand means existing magician, but if there wasn't any such thing, then the definition wouldn't correspond to anything real. And maybe God is like that, defined as existing, but to exist according to a definition is not to have been proven to actually exist in reality. Okay, and then so the cosmological argument was the second argument in our series that we looked at. That was last lecture. So just a couple of quick reviews. Or actually, if anybody here could give me just anything about the basics of that argument, like what, you don't have to give every detail, but what would be like a brief summary of the ideal of the argument, the cosmological argument? How did it start off? Let's go with that. What was the first thing he said in that paper? He said, imagine that you're a person who's doing something. Who's doing what? Just to review the Richard Taylor cosmological argument. The beginning of his essay involved an example. Yeah, okay, Ronald, every event has a cause. Yes, that follows from this sphere in the woods thing. So he says, if you were in the woods and you saw a sphere, what would that lead to? That would lead to thoughts and questions like, how did it get there, right? What's that thing doing there? That's weird. So he uses that example to try and illustrate the point that whether it's a weird or a normal thing, such a question can always be asked. What is its origin? Where did it come from? What is the cause of that thing? You know, you don't ask that question about like this can of La Croix in my hand because it's just a beverage that you probably wouldn't, you'd see in a typical situation like this. But you could ask the same question. You could be like, well, what's the ultimate origins of this? You know, going back to the factory and the assembly line and the raw materials and everything that ultimately led to its existence. So you could ask that question about the sphere, but you could also ask it about anything normal. Okay, which leads us into that principle of sufficient reason, which basically says that. It says that in the case of anything that is true, there had to be some cause or explanation for it. All right, so after that, there's the two kinds of truths, yeah? Now, these two kinds of truths, there's contingent and there's necessary. What are the contingent truths? Contingent truths are things that are true, but what about them? They they could have been false, right? Like they didn't need to happen, even though they did. If things had gone differently, then they wouldn't have happened that way, or wouldn't have happened at all. Like me being here speaking to you and lecturing to you, this would not be happening if my parents didn't meet each other. So my life and existence is contingent on that. And, you know, like there's wildfires burning all up in the Sierras and stuff. And it happened as, do you guys know about the story? Maybe you don't. Gender reveal part. To me, I still don't fully understand what that is. What, when you find out it's a boy or a girl, you set stuff on fire? You guys are going to have to tell me what that's all about. But anyway, there was a gender reveal party. That's the cause of those fires. So, you know, with the fires happening, gender reveal was the ultimate explanation. And that's contingent. Now, there are also necessary truths, though. Necessary truths are truths that couldn't possibly be false. So things like math or logic or geometry. 2 + 2 is 4. You know, there's 3 sides to a triangle. The interior angles of a triangle all add to 180 degrees, you know, so there's all kinds of necessary truths that couldn't be false. They're not matters of possibility or circumstance, but they're just like logical truths. Okay, so after that, the point is made that, you guys are too funny, but anyway, yeah, the point is made after that, that the universe exists. You know, the universe exists, and since the universe exists, what's his position? That it seems that it's contingent. This universe which exists is contingent, meaning that although it exists, it seems conceivable that it might not have existed if things had gone differently, you know? So if it's contingent, then the principle of sufficient reason applies to it, just as much as to any other contingent fact, like that I exist, or that you exist, or that, you know, this lecture is happening. Any contingent truth has to have some cause or explanation behind it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. So the universe exists as contingent. It must have a cause. And then we're close to the end of his argument. Because what does he say next? He says, all right, well, there's got to be a cause for the universe, but what could it possibly be? Okay, let's try a few attempts. Could it be the universe somehow causing itself to exist? No, that can't be. Because for something to cause another thing, it has to already exist. So something can't be its own cause. Like you cannot be your own parent or give birth to yourself. This is like completely incomprehensible. So the universe cannot birth itself any more than anything else can. That's just logically contradictory. So the next possibility is, okay, well, what if some contingent being is the cause of our universe? What was the problem with that suggestion? If something contingent caused the universe, why does he say, no, that won't work either? Who could tell me? What's the problem? What is the issue with the concept of something contingent causing the universe? Okay, good, because yeah, what caused that? And it leads to what is called an infinite regress. If our universe is caused by some other being, but that being is not the ultimate being, then that being must have a cause. And so on and so on and so on, until we reach something that's not contingent on anything. So what he's saying is that since an infinite regress is absurd, and since self-causation of the universe is also absurd, the only leftover possibility is that there is a necessary being which initiates the universe and causes everything within it to happen. And that necessary being that does not depend on anything is God. Okay, so the thought of God being a necessary being means that he's not contingent on anything. He doesn't depend on anything for his existence. Everything else that is contingent comes from him and depends on him. But he, being a necessary being, is independent and doesn't have any higher factors or causal sources behind him that bring him into existence. Okay, so that's his argument for God's existence. It's basically the idea that the principle of sufficient reason is true, the universe is contingent, it therefore has to have a cause, and the only viable cause that could explain it would be some necessary being, because a contingent being just kicks the can down the road to another being that we still have to wonder about where it came from. So the ultimate origins of everything can't be something that started from something else. It has to be the first thing, which means that it has to be of a different order. It has to be something necessary, something that's not dependent. Okay, so that's the argument, just one more statement of it. And okay, so now what we're going to do is we're just going to move on to the next argument in the series. And yeah, Joel, if you're still here watching or listening, you got to do something about the email thing, because I never received any email from you. Try and send it. Did you send it? Go to the delivery message. Go to your sent file and check on the status of it. You know, maybe like double check the spelling. I feel like there's got to be an issue because I'm not having delivery issues with students. Through Gmail, is it because you're sending it to me through Gmail or through your school email? What is your see, rvulich@fullerton.edu. If you send me anything to that address, I'm gonna receive it. I don't have any like filters or anything. So it's just kind of weird. Huh. Okay, yeah, well, back to what I was saying. So next argument in the list. Yeah, use your school email then, because maybe it's getting caught up in some type of spam filter. I don't really know. Use your school email. Send me another message. Let's make sure I get it. Okay, so the next argument in this series is called the argument from design. Yeah? Argument from design. Okay, so the argument from design is an interesting argument that we can trace back to Paley, William Paley. And you know, you might find more ancient versions of it that are older than this, but we're looking at the version written by a British philosopher named William Paley. I'm just going to give you the dates of his life here. Yeah, so William Paley lived from 1743 to 1805. Okay, 1743 to 1805. The argument from design that we're looking at here was published in 1800. So kind of closer to the end of his life, he wrote a book that contained this argument in it. And that's the one that we're all looking at right now. Okay. So the argument from design, it goes in its own direction trying to prove the existence of God. It's a little different from the cosmological argument, but ironically enough, it also starts with a hypothetical scenario of a person walking in the woods. So imagine that a person's walking in the woods, but in this case, they don't come across some weird like sphere, but instead just a watch, okay, like a watch, like I'm wearing a watch on my wrist. Now, he says, if you came across a stone, for example, like just a rock, you might look at the rock there in the woods and say to yourself, that's always been there. Maybe that doesn't have any origin, you know, because it's just a part of the woods. But if you saw a watch, you would know at least that that watch had to originally start from what source? Like, what's the only way that a watch can come to exist? What's the origins of watches? They can only come about through what kind of events? Someone has to make the watch. Exactly, yes, Madison. Someone has to make the watch. So how is it so obvious, though, that it has to come from a person with some intelligence? What is it about that thing that just makes that abundantly obvious to any reasonable person? That the only thing that could cause a watch was an intelligent being. It's probably because, and I think you guys are kind of indicating this, that it is able to serve a purpose, the purpose of telling time, right? The watch is a carefully designed instrument which monitors and measures the passage of time. Now, something that can perform a task like that, which has a function, as it is sometimes called, something with a function or a purpose, like the purpose of telling time, according to Paley, any common sense person would understand that could not come from anywhere except from an intelligence. So the principle he takes away from this watch example is that if something has a purpose or a function, then it must have had an intelligent designer or creator. So I'm going to put that information here and we'll talk about it more. So the point of the watch example is to get us to this conclusion that anything that has a purpose or function must have been created by an intelligent designer. So if it has this, then it has to have come from something like that. Okay? Now, there's all these reasons, right, why it seems so clear. It's because it has a purpose or a function. And when you think about how fine-tuned all the pieces have to be for it to serve that purpose, then you get a sense that it only can happen through a deliberate act of intentional measurement. The little things in the watch that have to turn just so that it can reliably measure the time. That would never have existed in that precise configuration unless it had been assembled with care by a being that had the intelligence to put it together for telling time. Right? Now, imagine that life never existed in the universe. Clearly it does, because here we are. But suppose that universe had gone differently and life never emerged. Don't you understand there would never have been watches in that case? Because it takes a being with a mind that wants to construct something that measures time for the watch to be produced. In nature, we would never have had a watch, right? It takes the intervention and action of an intelligent being to generate those things out of the raw materials of nature, okay? And so he talks about that. Let me read his words, and you can see how this man said it back then. So he says on page 31, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for all I know, to the contrary, it's been there forever. Nor would it be very easy to show this as an absurd answer, but suppose I found a watch upon the ground, and it was asked how the watch happened to be there. I would never give the answer which I gave before, that for all I know, the watch might have always been there. But why not? Why isn't this as good for the watch as for the stone? For this reason, and for none other, namely, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not see in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, of a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner, or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. And then he goes into all the little detailed inner workings of the watch. Well, Dante, you're on the right track. That's where he's leading in the end, but he's taking it slow. The first step of his argument doesn't mention God yet. It just mentions the example of a watch as a thing with a purpose, and then the related intuition that he thinks is obvious to everybody, that no one would deny that the watch had to have an intelligent maker. And he says the reason that it's so evident to you that the watch has an intelligent maker is just because it carries out a purpose, and all the pieces have to be so carefully arranged and assembled in the precise way they are for it to carry out that purpose. Okay? He's going to lead us to that conclusion that you're writing there. Yeah, but this is just the first step of that larger case. The first step is, if a thing has a purpose, it's got to have an intelligent designer, and the example that he uses to put that across is this example of a watch. Now, he's writing this in the year 1800. So why does he use the watch? Because I think at that point in time, it would have been one of the more impressive items of like human industry and technology. But if this is written today, you know, any other number of examples could have been given instead. You could say, suppose you found a MacBook computer in the woods, like just discarded off near some like ditch. When you come across the MacBook, you would know that that had to start with some intelligent manufacturer, because the computer with all the chips and circuits and everything, which is made for the purposes of computing, would never have been able to exist unless there was an intelligent being that arranged all the parts of it just in that particular way. Okay, so the example of the watch is just his chosen example, but we could use any number of examples of anything, like an item of human technology that carries out a purpose, whether it's a watch, a thermometer, cell phone, computer, you know, glasses like these, or anything else. Okay, so far so good. Watch example, point taken, that if you see something like that that has a purpose or function, it had to have a creator. That's his just point that he's making there. And he believes no one's going to disagree with that much. He's presenting that so that we can all get on the same page. Okay, now, after that, he wants to make a few points about things that would not cause you to doubt that the watch had a maker. So this is like a kind of interesting section. It's a little confusing at first, but I'll explain. He says, here are some things that would never cause a person to disagree that the watch had a maker. So let me erase this and put the idea here. So I'm just going to label this note as factors that would not change your mind or opinion that the watch had a maker. So it says factors that would not cause you to doubt that the watch has an intelligent designer. So here's one of these factors. One is, suppose that you have never seen a watch being made. Okay, so this idea, watches. I'm wearing one, some of you maybe are wearing some, but how many of us have really seen a watch literally being assembled and put together like in a watch factory? Maybe some of you have taken the time to watch one of those interesting like videos on the internet, how it's made or something. You saw watches on an assembly line. But I would argue that probably most all of us have never ourselves witnessed the assembly of a watch and what it takes to put them together. So yeah, how it's made is interesting for that kind of stuff, but still, I mean, it's not, I would say, the most common case. Most people, you know, they have to have some interest in the profession of watchmaking or some kind of personal stake in it. For most of us, I would argue, we probably haven't seen it. But even if you have, we can make the point regardless. Suppose that a person has not ever seen a watch being made. Well, if you've never seen one being made, do you think that would make you wonder whether or not the watch really has a maker? Like if you hadn't seen it made with your own eyes, then now all bets are off. I don't know, does a watch come from an intelligent being, or does it just somehow spontaneously erupt out of thin air? Does it fall from the sky? Does it grow out of the ground? I really don't know. I've never seen one being made, so I can't tell you. Clearly that's ridiculous, right? The point is this. Even though you haven't seen a watch being made, or even if you haven't seen a watch being made, that does not seriously cause you to doubt that it has an intelligent designer. Because the thing is, it's obvious enough that it has the carefully arranged inner workings to tell time, and it's clear and obvious enough that that type of architecture cannot happen randomly unless it's guided by an intelligence doing it. So even though you've maybe never seen a watch being made, that would not lead anybody to really doubt that it had a maker. Okay, so things that would not cause you to doubt that it had a maker. Why is he mentioning this? Well, because later on, as I'm sure you're kind of getting the sense of this, he's going to ultimately say nature is something that has to have an intelligent creator, because how impressive is it that plants grow and, you know, generate photosynthesis from the sun? Or how impressive is it that, like, I don't know, biological systems have all the features they need to survive? Like the fish has fins and the man has the opposable thumb. You know, so if we are functional, then the same should be said of us as much as with the watch. And he has to kind of raise these points to ward off possible objections, because he's anticipating somebody saying something like this. You say that human beings and living systems have purpose, so they must have been created by an intelligent designer, but I've never seen a divine being going through the process of putting life forms together like in the heavenly realm. I've never seen that, so if I haven't seen it, I don't know if that's really the reason that it exists. He's saying that would be silly for you to say about a watch, like, until I see it being made, I don't really know if it came from some intelligence. So since that's not a viable reason to doubt that the watch has a maker, it's not going to be a viable reason to doubt that, you know, things in nature have maker also, in this case, God. But that's only one of these factors. Next, he mentions this. Suppose that the watch has a flaw. Okay, so another possibility. Suppose that you come up across this watch, like you just find it somewhere, like as he describes, walking around in the woods or on a hike. So you find this watch, and you're like, whoa, that's cool. You pick it up, but you look at the watch, and it's not actually properly functioning. Suppose the watch is right now broken, maybe being left out in random ditch, it's taken on some damage. So it's not working right. Like say that the second hand just keeps ticking back and forth, so it's not actually reading the time off the right way. So that's a broken watch, isn't it? That's not a properly functioning watch. Does this watch with the defect start to make you question whether it has a maker of intelligence? The designer creation have any flaws, right? No, that's silly, right? Even though a watch has a, let's say, occasional defect, it's still perfectly obvious that it had to have issued from an intelligent designer simply because the way that it was arranged is for the purposes of telling time in the general case, even if this particular example of a watch bears some defects or flaws. Okay, so like, I don't know, you find a cell phone somewhere, it's got a cracked display, and the volume buttons don't work, but you can turn it on with the power button. This is not a properly functioning cell phone. So is this one that maybe did not come from an intelligent source? Of course not. Whether it's slightly defective, fully functional, or something in between, it's obviously something that was created with the intent of performing its typical function. And therefore, there's no doubt at all that it has an intelligent maker, whether it's something you've never seen being made or whether it does have some type of flaw. And yet again here, this is going to be his response if someone were to say, you claim that there's things with a purpose in nature and God created them, but don't natural things sometimes have defects? Like can't children be born blind, or can't the person have a congenital heart defect that makes it so that they have a much lower life expectancy? Those are defective copies of a human organism or something, or other life forms. Does this mean that we can question whether or not it came from something intelligent? And he's saying no, it's not any more reasonable to question that thing coming from an intelligent source than it is to say that a defective watch must have issued from some intelligence. Here's another point he makes. Suppose you don't know how the watch works. You just don't understand how it works. Okay, so if you don't know how it works, like, I mean, I'm not a electrical engineer or anything. I mean, I could probably learn that stuff pretty easily if I really wanted to focus on it, but, I focus on other things. And nonetheless, if I, like, turn on my Nintendo Switch or something, I'm playing the video game and I know it works. Do I know how it works? Like, do I know all the precise facts about the electricity and the chips and the processor that allow it to work? No, not really. Some people that are very specialized on that, they know all those details. But I don't. Nonetheless, lacking that knowledge, do I have a valid reason to start questioning whether it even came from an intelligent source? No. So like you don't really need to know all the specifics of how a thing functions to know that it does come from something intelligent, like cars, right? The internal combustion engine, it's a great piece of human ingenuity that we ever created that, and we use cars all the time. But I'm not a person like who could really rattle off to you the details of how they function exactly. But I don't need to know all those details to understand that it did come from something intelligent. So in the case of nature, how does photosynthesis work? You studied it maybe in biology classes, but if you have forgotten that information or if you never knew it in the first place, that still wouldn't cause you to have any kind of lingering doubts about whether that thing came from something intelligent, as long as the author would argue, right? So not knowing how something that has a purpose works, or seeing that it has a flaw, or never having witnessed it being made, none of those things really cause any significant doubt that it has got an intelligent creator, at least not in the case of the watch. And then he makes one more point. I'll just speak about it because I think it's kind of a little bit of an afterthought, but he says, furthermore, nobody would say that the watch might have come about through some random process that's just chance. Like nobody would say that unguided, random chance events lead to the existence of a watch. Like how ridiculous would this be if somebody thought, I don't know where a watch comes from. You say someone intelligent put it together, but maybe what really happened was there was like a hurricane and a thunderstorm and a volcano, and all those elements and dust got kicked up into the atmosphere, and then somehow randomly just spit out a watch, from the tornado, like just completely unlikely chance event. Nobody would think that either. Nobody would think that a watch with all of its internal complexity and ability to perform a function could possibly be something that just generates from a random process of things banging into each other, okay? So it takes an intelligence to create the watch because it's got a purpose. That's the takeaway here. That's the bottom line. And here are factors that still don't even lead to any doubts about the ultimate origin of the watch, okay? So that's all setting us up now for what you know is coming next. And that's when he draws an analogy between the watch and its origin and things like us and things in nature and our origins, which he's going to say lie with God. Okay, so so then the conclusion of his analogy is this. Things in nature that have a purpose or function also must have an intelligent designer. And that intelligent designer is God. So it's like an analogy, and when you ever construct an analogy, you say this is to that, like A is to B as C is to D. Okay, so the watchmaker is to the watch as what is to what in this person's argument, in Paley's argument. The relation that the relation that the watchmaker stands into the watch is the relation that God stands into nature, exactly. And he's saying the analysis given of the origin of the watch carries over seamlessly to the example of nature and God. Okay, because just as much as the watch, there are things found in nature that have got very impressive function and internal complexity that bears the marks of design. Just take, for example, the eye, which if you have got vision, you're seeing right now using your eyes this broadcast lecture on your screen or on your device. But the eye, in order to have the function of vision, has to be very, very well adjusted with all the little rods and cones just so arranged. So you might say then that if there was no other conclusion that a person could draw about the origin of a watch besides saying that it had to come from something intelligent, because watches with all that sophistication and purpose can't possibly generate from some random process, then you would have to say the same, he argues, with things found in nature that also exhibit this kind of functional complexity. And that's seen in all sorts of things, the eyes that we have, the ears that we have, so any body part that performs a function within an environment, the nose is to smell, the ears are to hear, they are stand-ins for the example of the watch just as well. Or the process of photosynthesis, or the weather cycle that provides nutrients to vegetation and other flora and fauna. All of those things, according to him, are even more impressive examples of things that do bear the trademark functions of design and purpose and internal complexity. So they must have an intelligent designer as well. But who could possibly be the intelligent designer of nature itself? We're not talking about the human designer of a watch, but the supernatural designer of nature, right? It has to be something outside of nature in order to be the architect of it. And therefore God would be that being, okay? So I'll just read then what he says here. He says, every indication, so he kind of compares at first the telescope with the eye to draw another analogy. He says, every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which exists in the watch exists in the works of nature, with this difference, that on the side of nature, it's greater and more, and in a degree which exceeds all computation. I mean that the contrivances of nature surpass the contrivances of art in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of the mechanism. And still more, if possible, do they go beyond them in number and variety. But in a multitude of cases, they are not less evidently mechanical, not less evidently designed, not less evidently accommodated to their end or suited to their office than the most perfect productions of human ingenuity. So he says, I know no better method of introducing so large a subject than that of comparing a single thing with a single thing, an eye, for example, with a telescope. As far as the examination of the instrument goes, there is precisely the same proof that the eye was made for vision
as there is that the telescope was made for assisting it. They are made upon the same principles, both being adjusted to the laws by which the transmission and reflection of rays of light are regulated. So, accordingly, we find that the eye of a fish, and that part of it called the crystalline lens, is much rounder than the eye of terrestrial animals. So what accounts for all of these very specific adaptations that the body part or organism of an intelligent designer that has applied their knowledge and skill to the construction of the thing. No, yeah, that's fine. I mean, your comment, AJ, God or a God, he's just saying that there's an author of the works of nature, and that is something that we should be able to understand, because we know that things that we are the authors of, the products of human invention, could not have come about in any other way, right? Like a car that can drive. It's not something that nature would have produced. It took a mind to want to have a transport system, and thus to derive the materials for it and to put them together so that it would exist. So if a thing as, you know, majestic and awesome and subtle and sophisticated as a set of eyes, or the human brain, or the beating of the heart, or whatever the case may be in other living animals, he thinks that the analogy holds, that they must have had an intelligent designer, because a thing with such a detailed purpose or function could not have come about through random stuff. Okay, and so now I just want to say, Joel, I finally got your email. And good. I've received it as of now, as of 5:54 p.m. So not to worry, I'll reply to you right after. I see that this one came in from your Gmail, so it finally did make it across. Not to worry, but just wanted to let you know that, Joel. Okay, so from here, we have to talk about some objections to these various arguments. Okay, so there's definitely objections that can be stated to all the various arguments that we've learned. We took a lot of time going over the ontological argument objections. Now we're going to have to take stock of whatever objections there are to both the cosmological argument and the argument from design. Okay. But does this make some sense to you guys, this argument from intelligent design? It basically says that things in nature bear just as much impressive function and internal complexity as things made by man. But when we see those things that are man-made, we know there's no other way they could have come about except through the invention and action of a mind, because no random process could produce such things as watches. So he thinks the same has to be true of us and other things in nature, because of how purposive and functional and internally complex our design appears to be. Okay, good. So next up, it's turning our attention to some objections. So now it's Ernest Nagel, the next author in the series. So this is an American philosopher originally born in the Czech Republic, and he lived from 1901 to 1985. Okay, Ernest Nagel, he was an atheist, and so obviously by definition he was not convinced by any of these arguments that he thinks God exists. He doesn't believe that God exists despite the force of these various arguments. He taught at Columbia University over on the East Coast for a lot of his life. In fact, I believe he got his bachelor's degree, PhD, and then taught there for most of his career. So he's deeply rooted in, or he was when he was living at Columbia. He wrote a book in the year 1959 called Philosophical Concepts of Atheism. And from that book, a little section has been printed in our text, and they retitled it, Does God Exist? So this is from 1959 by Nagel, called Does God Exist? So his overall goal in this writing is to try and ask this question, does God exist? But to do so by examining some of the big arguments that have been presented in history, so some of the ones that we've all talked about. He then goes on a little tour through them, showing what he finds to be the flaws and mistakes of each argument, to show why, in his judgment, they don't win out the day and that they don't actually succeed. Yeah, not to worry. Thanks, Joel. Glad we were able to straighten that one out. So yeah, he's setting out to form criticisms of all the major arguments that God exists. So he's going to speak about each one. The first one that he talks about is the cosmological argument. Okay, and he has some very good and I think straightforward criticisms of it. So I'm going to put those up here on the board now that we've got the title and the essay and the author information. Okay, so I'm going to label this board note as problems with the cosmological argument. According to Nagel, but others have raised the same issues as he is mentioning here. Problems with the cosmological argument. Okay then, so what are these so-called problems? First of all, let me talk to you about the summary that he provides of the argument itself, because I think it's very good, brief, and well stated, even though it skips over some of the extra details, but that's to be expected because it's very concise. So here's what he says in summary of the cosmological argument first, before he goes on to criticize it. He says, all right, on page 34, one of the oldest arguments for theism is the cosmological argument, also known as the argument from the first cause. Yeah, just so you know, there are these other synonymous names for the cosmological argument. Sometimes it's called the argument from the first cause. Sometimes it's called the argument from the prime mover. First cause, prime mover, because God is described in the argument as the first thing that causes everything else. The first mover that initiates everything. But anyway, call it what you will. Cosmological argument. Briefly put, the argument runs as follows. Every event has to have a cause. So an event A must have as cause some event B, which in turn must have as cause some event C, and so on. But if there is no end to this backwards sequence of causes, then the sequence would be infinite. And in the opinion of those that make this argument, an infinite sequence of events is impossible and absurd. Therefore, there must be a first cause, and that first cause is God, the initiator of everything else. Okay, so that is his kind of briefly stated summary, my little explanation of it. But what we really want to focus on next are what is his criticisms of that? What does he say is problematic and faulty about that argument? All right, so here are the problems. First of all, he says, problem number one, is it really true that everything has to have a cause? Maybe not. I'm posing it as a question, but it's really an assertion. He's saying it is perhaps not necessary that everything has to have a cause. Now, the argument, the cosmological argument, assumes, yes, everything has to have a cause. This universe is a thing, so it has to have a cause too, and that gets us to God. But right off the bat, Nagel questions this. He says, well, who says that everything has to have a cause? Maybe most things do, like me and you and like the existence of this planet and lots of stuff. But perhaps the set of all things doesn't need to have a cause, like, right? So maybe the totality of the universe is something that does not need to have a cause. Perhaps, therefore, the general idea that everything has to have a cause is not really true. But suppose that we grant this premise. Suppose that we allow that, yeah, everything has to have a cause. Well, there's still further problems, even if we grant this. Suppose that everything has to have a cause. Well, if everything has to have a cause, what do you think is the problem? If everything has to have a cause, why doesn't what need to have a cause? That's the second problem here. If all things have to have a cause, then why don't what have a cause? What do you think is the problem that I'm hinting at here? The second one. Sure, yes, what caused the cause? Right. But in this case, the specific example is that God is the cause of everything. So yeah, why wouldn't God have to have a cause? If the argument says everything has to have a cause, how is it consistent to say, oh, but not God then? Right? So that's the second one. If everything has to have a cause, then why doesn't God need to have a cause? Okay, so the second problem there, if everything must have a cause, then why wouldn't God have to have one too? You know, you could argue that the argument of cosmological argument is sort of self-defeating because it says everything has a cause, but not God though. Yeah, the first point, well, it does contradict the first point. Claims that are made at once. These are just different independent criticisms. So on the one hand, you might have this problem. I don't know if everything has to have a cause. But suppose that that's not your issue and you believe that everything has to have a cause. Okay, well, here's a second distinct problem. And that is, assuming everything has to have a cause, if we do assume that, why is it that God wouldn't have to have one, right? A person could fairly say that that seems inconsistent. You know, everything has to have a cause except for one thing. You know, if the argument is trying to get us to agree that God exists because everything has a cause, then how can it so strongly deny that God is something that has a cause, right? It seems to want us to believe in the existence of all things having a cause up to a certain point, and then to just turn off that line of questioning once we get to the being called God. So that's the second problem, but good point and observation, Sierra. And then a third problem, I'll just put it up here since we've seen the heading. Okay, so so they say that God does not have to have a cause in this argument, right? Everything else does, but not God though, because he's the one necessary being that starts it all. Okay, well, if there could be something that hasn't got a cause, like they say God is, if there could be a being with no cause, then why not just assume that it's which being instead of God? What do you think is this next point, next problem? If there could be something with no cause, like God is being claimed to be, then why not just assume that this is the uncaused being, the universe? Yes. So that's the next point. If there can be if there can be something with no cause, okay, what it says here is that if there can be something with no cause, then why can't the universe be that thing? You know, and if that was so, then we wouldn't have to make any additional assumption that there's something beyond and different and outside of the universe like God. The cosmological argument asks us to accept that there is a necessary being and everything depends on it. Okay, well, if that one necessary being is uncaused, why suppose that it's something supernatural that goes over and outside of the universe? Couldn't it just be that the universe is the self-caused or necessary being, and therefore there's no need to assume anything further? In a way, if you believed that the universe was a necessary being, you could perhaps be on less controversial ground than supposing that God is, because the universe is known to exist. Not a single person anywhere thinks there's no such thing as the universe, or at least it's hard to imagine a person thinking that, because here you are, you're in it. So if there's no universe, then where would you be? That wouldn't make sense. So the universe is something that's known to exist. If it's the necessary being, then that necessary being is not a matter of speculation. But if God is the necessary being that really starts everything, well, that relies on assumptions about things that we are not as sure about whether they exist. The existence of the universe is undisputable. But the existence of God is exactly what's being debated on either side of these arguments. So in case one were, happy with the suggestion that there's a necessary being, this point merely questions why it cannot be that the universe serves that position instead of God. Okay, and then there's one more little problem that he mentions here. And it's this problem. Maybe I can sneak it in right here, actually, without erasing anything. It's this question: is an infinite regress really impossible? Maybe an infinite regress is not impossible. The last point here, the last problem with the cosmological argument is this point, that maybe the so-called idea of an infinite regress is not impossible. So remember that an important element of the cosmological argument was the part where it said the universe depends on something, it's got to have a cause. But whatever that cause is cannot be contingent, because that would just lead us to ask about its cause, and on and on and on to infinity. But an infinite regress is impossible, so it's got to stop somewhere, and it's got to stop with something that's not contingent so that it can be the first thing, right? Now, what this objection is questioning is that whole line of thinking that an infinite regress cannot be possible. Maybe it's not impossible. So in other words, maybe there really could be causes on causes on causes to infinity, and it never ever ends, and it just goes back to infinity. Is that really impossible? The argument says that it is, but Nagel says maybe not. Here is a further reason to assume that perhaps the concept of actual infinity, actually infinite number of causes, might be possible. Because we already have a basic understanding of the concept of actual infinity, or of an infinite sequence of things, from mathematics and geometry, okay? So like, for example, the number line, right? Take the number line. Take 2 points along that number line, 0 and 1. Are there any numbers in between 0 and 1? I think you know the answer. Yes, there definitely are. There are all of the decimals and stuff that are in between 0 and 1. So how many of those are there? It's infinite, isn't it? Suppose that we take the midpoint between 0 and 1. It's 0.5. Is there a midpoint between 0 and 0.5? Yes. It's 0.25. And is there a midpoint between 0 and 0.25? Yes. 0.125. And we could keep doing this, splitting the range of the numeric line in half. And we would never ever be able to exhaust all of the values, because we could simply generate a new one by adding another decimal position. You understand? So that's very fascinating, because it means there are just as many values in between 0 and 1 as there are on the entire actually infinite number line. So that is one way of kind of thinking, modeling the idea of actual infinity in your mind. It's any situation where a subset of the system has just as many elements as the whole set does, okay? So if there's a way of thinking about actual infinity in mathematical terms, then why couldn't it be that the timeline of past history is also actually infinite, and it's a infinitely dense line? We could also take the example from geometry. Take 2 points that lie along a geometric line. So if we have this line, which is A to B, this is a midpoint right here, M. Is there a midpoint between A and M? Yes. Call it M prime. Is there a midpoint between A and M prime? Yes. M double prime. And we could keep doing this to infinity yet again. So whether you're thinking about it in spatial terms or numeric terms, we already have got mathematical concepts of actually infinite series. So to the claim that it cannot be that the sequence of causes goes back and back to infinity, that's just mind-boggling and incomprehensible. The author Nagel says, if you've analyzed the mathematical analysis of infinity, we can comprehend basic ideas of infinity through those analyses. And thus, it deprives the cosmological argument of a key pillar, which is that an infinite regress is absurd. So that cannot do. So there must be a first member of the sequence, and that is God, the necessary being. Okay? So let me just read then his words on this, and that will, I think, bring home what I've discussed. So he says, sorry. He says, the argument is an ancient one, and it has impressed many generations of keen minds. But the argument is nonetheless weak. He says, let us waive any question concerning the validity of the principle that every event has a cause. So he says, setting that question aside, but it's still a valid question, does everything have to have a cause? And we talked about that. He says next, if this is assumed, it is surely inconsistent to postulate a first cause as a way of escaping from the infinite series. Because if everything has to have a cause, why doesn't God need one as well? The standard answer is that he doesn't need one because he is self-caused. But if God can be self-caused, why can't the universe be self-caused? So we've talked about that other problem, that if we allow the concept of a necessary being, then why suppose it's anything other than the universe? In which case, there's no separate God that brought it into being. Then he says, on the other hand, the supposed inconceivability of an infinite series of causes, familiarity with a modern mathematical analysis of infinity. So that's why he says the cosmological argument doesn't stand up under scrutiny. And that's how he rests his case on that one. But he's got criticism still for the others as well. Yeah, infinite answers. You know, thinking about the infinite is a very trippy and weird thing, because we're finite beings, but we're in a system that's much larger than us that could be infinite. I mean, we'll get into all really deep metaphysical mysteries of space and time when we get to Einstein later in the class, but already you can start thinking about those things deeply, and it's quite fascinating. I mean, this is one of the things that I love about philosophy, right? Because we're human beings. We're the only things out there that can even ponder any of these thoughts. You've seen my cats, and they're very cute and cuddly and actually quite smart, but I guarantee you they can't scratch the surface of thinking about any of these dense topics that we're discussing. So it's kind of like your privilege, maybe somewhat a burden, but I would look at it as like a privilege of being a human being, the most advanced life form maybe in the whole universe, that we can actually look in this universe and try and understand our place in it and understand the bigger picture. Even if we can't always get to the answers, even being able to ask the questions is, like, I think, a great, awe-inspiring aspect of just what we are. I mean, you can't forget what you are. You're a human being, and there's billions of us, but we are just very impressive life forms overall, I think. Okay, so yet we have more to say on this. So he also has a criticism of the ontological argument, but I don't want to spend much time on it because we've already talked a lot about those criticisms, and he doesn't have one that's much different from G.E. Moore. His criticism of the ontological argument is essentially the same as Moore. He says existence is not an attribute, and therefore the argument doesn't work because it assumes that existence is an attribute that a perfect being would have to have. His example, though, is a slightly different example, so I'm just going to say it one time so that you hear how he makes the point. All right, so he says, take, for example, a $100 bill. The blue face. Sometimes there's still, if you have an older one, it's green, but in our currency, we have these big Benjamin Franklin $100, okay? Now, right now, there's, 34 of us are in this meeting. I don't know if any of us that are watching this has 100 with them, but if you do or if you don't, doesn't the definition of that unit of currency remain the same? Like, it's not like the definition of $100 bill changes when you get one and it's in your wallet, and then it changes again when you spend it and it's no longer in your possession. So the definition of that concept has nothing to do with whether it exists or not. That's his point. So you might have a $100 bill with you right now, or you might not. But either way, the definition of what that concept is the same. That's his way of trying to make the same point as Moore, that whether something exists or not is not a part of its description. Let me give you a different example than his, the $100 bill thing, because it's a little weird. Take dinosaurs, right? Like an extinct species, for example. We know what they are, and we know what features they would have had, right? Or that they did have, actually, because we recover their fossils and we can analyze that in conjunction with what we know about the evolution of species and the type of animals that later evolved from them. So we know a lot about the dinosaurs, but they don't exist. Now, if tomorrow we found some of their DNA and used it to replicate them genetically and now create like a Jurassic Park, now the dinosaurs starting tomorrow would exist again. And then maybe they get out of control and we have to nuke them and then they don't exist anymore. But whether they come into being, go out of being, the definition is not changing at all throughout that whole process. See, the definition just is what it is, and it has nothing to do with whether something exists that matches the definition or not, right? So in the same way, the definition of God has nothing to do with whether God exists or not. Whether he exists or not is a separate question from how you define the being. So his example is of the $100 bill. I give you the dinosaur example, but they're both trying to make the same point 3 times over that G.E. Moore has already made, which is that if you are trying to think of something that is a property of something, an attribute of something, you're not thinking of existence. That's just wrong. When you have $100 bills and it exists in your pocket, it's the same definition as when it doesn't exist in your pocket. The definition of dinosaur is the same whether it exists or whether it doesn't exist. So the definition of God has nothing to do with existence or non-existence. That would be his way of making the same point that we've kind of observed in the other author's work too. Okay, so next is his criticism of the argument from design. Okay, and he has a couple of problems with it. So let me see if I can get these out there on the table before we end for today. Yeah, so problems with the design argument that we just learned from William Paley. Okay, so first problem that he has is how it is that we're so clear that a thing with purpose has a designer. Or how we know that the watch, for example, used in the original author's essay, how it is that we really know that the watch has an intelligent designer. According to Nagel, it's not actually that it has a purpose or a function. The real reason that we know that the watch has a designer is a much more perhaps boring and straightforward or even more obvious reason. The reason we know for sure that the watch was created by some intelligent thing is because we ourselves are the creators. We're the human beings who create those watches. So we're definitely in position to say 100% we know that they have been created by something that is intelligent. But it's not so much so that it has a purpose or a function. Because anything that we know has been created by humans, whether it had a purpose or a function or not, would still lead to the same conclusion. Like, so for example, if you saw like a big modern art sculpture, it just looks like, I don't know, a cube or something painted hot pink, and it's sitting in an art gallery. That doesn't really have any purpose or function. It's not there to do anything or to accomplish any like practical task. It's an aesthetic object of artistic appreciation. But don't you automatically know that that has an intelligent creator also, just because we are the ones who make artworks like that? So the real reason that we know that the watch has a maker is not so much to do with it having a purpose or a function, but just the boring, basic, obvious fact that we make the watches. That's why we know that it has a maker. Okay? So the real reason that we know the watch has a maker is because we make the watches, not because it has a function or a purpose. Okay, and then the next thing that he does is kind of like a 1-2 punch. He starts by saying, first of all, knowing that the watch has a maker has nothing to do with it having a purpose. Second, then, he says this, concerning the works of nature that have a purpose, there's a totally different explanation that can be given as to where that purpose or function has come from that doesn't rely on the assumption of God. And that would be, what do you think? This alternative, naturalistic explanation of how things in nature come to acquire a purpose or function. What is that? Not a theological idea, but a naturalistic idea. The way that they say science, right, but what specific concept of science? We all know this. It's the idea of what generates purpose and function in nature, if not God. They call it evolution, right? And evolution, Darwin's evolutionary biology. Okay, so that's the second point. There is a better explanation for how things in nature acquire a purpose or function, and that is Darwinian biology, the theory of evolution. Okay, so first of all, he's saying that the analogy which is being made between the eye and a watch, for example, like Paley's analogy, he says the watch is like the eye, and the watchmaker stands to the watch as God stands to the eye and to other things in nature. But now Nagel is saying this is a weak analogy. The similarity between the two things, that they both have a function, like, for example, the eye and the watch, that similarity is actually not so significant to the description of the two things. We know that the watch has a creator. The existence of a creator for a watch is known just because we make those watches ourselves. So we would know that we make those watches whether they had any real purpose or not. Okay? So one element of the analogy has been made weak. The fact that they both have a function or purpose is not really relevant to describing the origins of both. And then when we consider what is the cause and the origin of the natural things, set the watch aside and now think just about stuff in nature like us or the eye or whatever, the explanation of how those things could have come to exist doesn't necessarily rely on the assumption of there being an intelligent designer, because we can explain those facts by means of evolution. And the theory of evolution does not presuppose that there's any divine being that's guiding the process of evolution. It's merely that when you have a set of organisms and chance variations within that set provide some with better features for the survival they're going to have in their environment, then they will naturally survive in greater numbers and propagate in greater numbers, thus over geologic timescales selecting for those traits that enhance their capacity to survive. So as long as we have this separate explanation for the function and purpose in nature, then that is sufficient to explain how those things came to exist. And concerning the case of things that are like eyeglasses or watches or whatever, and how those have come to exist, yes, they've got a function, but we know that they have a creator not so much because of their function, but merely because we are those who have created it. So the link between anything with a function and the existence of a creator has been weakened in two different ways. First, because there's no need to assume that the knowledge we have of our own creations is because they have a function. And secondly, because when it concerns nature and the functional things within it, there are entirely different and better supported explanations for how that could have happened that don't rely on any idea of an intelligent being crafting it for some purpose. Okay? That's why he says this in the essay, and I'll leave you with this, and then when we come back on Thursday, I'm just going to wrap up the last few pieces of his discussion, Nagel. Then we're going to talk about Pascal's wager, which is going to be like, I think, the last argument given in our class towards the existence of God. And then we'll talk about W.K. Clifford. So we have some more material to cover then, but we're doing pretty good so far. Here's the last word I wanted to give you on his criticisms of the design argument. He says, the conclusion of the argument is based on an analogy. The watch and the world are alike in possessing a congruence of parts and an adjustment of means to ends. The watch has a watchmaker, so the world must have a world maker. But is this a good analogy? Let us once more set aside whether the universe is the system that's got order, which the watch admittedly is. That's also another possible problem, right? If you look out in nature, it's kind of cherry picking to just say, oh, here's a bird that can fly, or here's like, a human being that can see. There's all kinds of stuff out there in nature that doesn't seem to perform any purpose, or quite the contrary, it's just destructive, like black holes and, supernova explosions. But anyway, setting that aside, let us concentrate on the question, what is the reason that we're so sure that watches can't come about except from an intelligent being? The answer is plain. It's because we've never run across a watch that's not been made by someone. We make those watches. But the situation is not like this in the case of the innumerable systems we see in nature. The argument loses all its force if the facts which the hypothesis of a divine designer is supposed to explain can be understood on the basis of a better supported assumption. And indeed, such an alternative explanation is one of the achievements of Darwinian biology, because Darwin showed that one can account for the variety of biological species as well as for their adaptations to the environment without invoking a divine creator and acts of special creation. And then he just gives a brief capsule description. The Darwinian theory explains the diversity of species in terms of chance variations in the structure of organisms and a mechanism of selection which retains those forms that possess some advantages for survival. And there's considerable evidence for that. So that's how he thus tries to, shut down and criticize at least the design argument. Now, after that, the last piece of his couple pages of his essay discuss a few additional miscellaneous arguments for God's existence that I find to be less central than the big three, the ontological, the cosmological, and the design. But he briefly goes over a couple of other assorted arguments in the literature, so I'll just take a few minutes at the top of next meeting to go over those. And then we'll transition into Pascal's wager and Clifford, the ethics of belief. So, continue reading through the syllabus. As I see here, today we got through Does God Exist? So the wager and the ethics of belief, that's the main topic next time, as well as a recap of this material here. Okay, guys, and like I say, I'm going to provide the essay prompts for you next time. So to Joel or anyone else, you're going to definitely know about the essay prompts, and we will discuss them at the next meeting. If we can't get into all the details, then I'll send some notes in the delivery system, Titanium, and we'll talk about it there too. Okay, guys, well, I guess probably we're good to go. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything that you'd like me to go over again, but I guess for now, it's probably time to shut it down for the time being. So have a good night, stay healthy and safe as always, and I'll be back here with you guys on Thursday then, okay? Oh, say hi. Little girl just jumped up. It's like she must have known that I'm finished. She's already happy, so yeah. Cool, guys. Have a great one. From me and Peachy. I'll see you guys next time. Cute kitty. Thank you.